this topic was Mongolia, and she speaks Mongolian. So that's a real plus as well. Before I turn this over to Heiko and Susan, I just want to put in a plug for our annual meeting. The Indiana German Heritage Society was founded in 1984. We are having our annual meeting on the 19th, Friday the 19th. And we also have a program, a speaker after that, and that'll be Dawn Heinrich Tolzmann, Professor Emeritus at University of Cincinnati, talking about the state of German American studies in the country, as well as based here in the Cincinnati and Midwest. So please join us for that. You can find information about that on our website. So please join us and join the organization. So I'm out of breath. So I'll turn this over to Heiko. Heiko, it's a pleasure to have you back. And he's a wealth of information. So if I had questions, I said, okay, there's Westphalia. What is Eastphalia? If there's West, what about the East? And he answered my question right off the bat. So that's the kind of guy he is. He knows the stuff. It's maps, it's history, it's folklore, oral history. He's dabbled in all those, and it's a good mix. Thank you, Heiko, and I'll turn this over to you and Susan. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Susan and I, we talked about it, and we decided Susan will go first and I will go second. And so I pass it on to Susan.
Yeah, thanks, Heiko. And thank you, Bill, and everyone from your society for welcoming us. Yeah, so I'm going to start out and just kind of give a brief overview of the project and a little bit of navigation into how to access some of the maps in our collection. And then Heiko is going to talk in more detail about some of the history involved with some of the maps. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let's see. I think it's that one. And I will start presenting. Okay, so here's our title, The Long Shadow of the Habsburg Empire, with some background map behind it, which I think is not from the Habsburg Empire, but I could be wrong. I forget which map we have in the background here. So I will go forward. So this is what I'm going to be talking about is our University of California, Berkeley Library's collection of German World War II captured maps. And behind the words here are just some screenshots, some snapshots of some of the diversity of types of mapping that you see in the collection. And I encourage you all to explore the maps. They're really interesting, both as historical documents and as works of art. So there's a lot to discover in there. A little bit of background about the project. So you may or may not know, after World War II, the US Army Map Service had collected a lot of maps, captured a lot of maps from foreign militaries, including the German military. And following the end of World War II, they brought those back to the US and started distributing some of those to academic and public libraries around the country as a way to distribute knowledge and build up the kind of institutional and skills, institutional knowledge and skills around the country so that they had a widely distributed network of information in different parts of the country. And UC Berkeley was one of the schools that received maps through this program. I think there were about 50 in total that received some of the captured maps, but it was part of a larger project to distribute maps that were also created by the Army Map Service and by our British counterparts. So it was part of a larger distribution project, but the captured maps were a really kind of niche part of that. And so a few years ago in 2017, I was contacted by the maps librarian at UC Riverside who had found some maps in her collection She was needing to make space for a renovation and reached out to me about possibly us at Berkeley taking in the Riverside maps to kind of combine our collections and give her some space to do some renovations. And that was a good impetus for us to take a look at our collection and begin to pull together these different map series that had been distributed to us by the Army Map Service, 60, 70 years ago. And for various reasons, which Heiko may get into, the library had never pulled these together as a collection. They were integrated into our library's general map collection, so they were definitely being used, but they weren't pulled together and called out for being part of this German captured maps collection. So that was one of our projects. And so we were working on updating how these maps were described in our library. And we also began a project to digitize the sheets so that we could make them available to people online across the world. So all of these maps are in the public domain as far as we know, and we're able to make them available to people. So as of March 2020, which just about a year ago now, we had processed approximately half of our German captured maps collection, which is about 10,000 maps in total. So when we're done with this project, we'll have a little over 20,000 maps available online. But as of when the pandemic started, we had about half of that collected. So I want to just take a brief pause and give some acknowledgements. And as part of this slide is to acknowledge that it really was a group effort. There were a lot of moving pieces going into making all of these maps available online and realizing what we had. So that included everything from student library employees who were helping with the processing of the maps to our information technology department, who really did a lot behind the scenes. We worked with an offsite shelving facility, which we are using to help create space in our on-campus collections and also preserve the maps for longer term. Because this involved kind of a joining together of two different libraries' collections, we also relied heavily on our interlibrary services and our mail and transportation services. And it really was kind of supported from the top down as a project as it emerged. So it really was a joint project to really put all these moving pieces together. And all of that moving pieces together resulted in our launch in August 2020. So we developed a website that includes links to the maps as well as some information about the project itself, and a short reading list, which gives more context for the captured maps collection and distribution and how they were used as well. So I'm gonna move out of my presentation slides now and try and do a live demo for you. So bear with me, and hopefully this goes well. Okay. So you can see there's a big explore the maps button on the, what is that, your left side of the screen. And that's the easiest way to get into the map collections. But we've also highlighted a few different ones at the top here that you can scroll through. So there's various kinds of ones that you can kind of get quick links to. And then we've also included a table that includes all of the different regions and map scales that are included with direct links to the maps and their indexes. And I'm gonna kind of go through this a little bit. So the map scale, for those of you who aren't familiar, if you see a smaller number on the right-hand side of the scale, that means it's more zoomed in. So 1 to 25,000 is pretty detailed. You can see individual buildings on the map. Whereas if you're looking at something that says 1 to 1 million, that's pretty zoomed out, and you won't be able to see buildings, but you get a sense of the regional geography. So I'm gonna look at one of these ones that's what's called a larger scale, so more zoomed in, and we'll look at the Österreicher Karte. And I hope my high school German teacher will forgive my pronunciation today. So we'll move forward. I'm gonna look at first at these indexes. So if I click on the index here, and I think we'll do that. That's gonna give you an overview of what area this map series covers. And each of those little squares on the image that you're seeing now, it represents one map. So let's say, and what we're viewing now is our digital collection site. So if I want to say, look at Salzburg, I kind of know where that is, let's say, and I know it's somewhere around here. I see it's under 63, and there's the word Salzburg there. So I know it's in this quadrant of 63. And on this particular map index, if I scroll over, you can see that they've numbered those little squares within the big square, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I know that I can figure out that the map that I'm interested in is in this big square called 63, and then it'll be 63, 4. So I'm gonna use that to find my map of Salzburg in the digital collection site. And this gets easier with practice, I promise. But some of the indexes are pretty convoluted and just kind of a little convoluted and dense. So even for the experts, it can take a while to figure out a particular index. So I would say, give it your best shot, but you can always email us if you get stuck too. So now I know we're at 63.4. I'm going to go back to the main site. And now that I have that number in my mind, and sometimes I even write it down, I'll go over to the maps. And this is where things get exciting. So now we're going to look at the actual sheets that make up that set that covers this area. And it's a little tiny, but I can kind of scroll down or search in the page to find my map. And here is the 63.4. And sure enough, this is covering the city of Salzburg. So this particular map, again, is pretty detailed. We can see individual buildings listed here. There's rivers and other kinds of features noted. And so that's kind of in a nutshell how you navigate the indexes and the maps. And you can use this online map viewer to zoom in and out. If you're interested in downloading the map to use in your own project or share with friends, you can do that as well. So you can download maps using this download button in the bottom left, and you can also share. So you can email people a link, or you can kind of scroll down the page, look at all the great information that Heiko has put in here about this map series, which tells you more about it. And you can see other ways to download the maps. So it's really got a lot of information in there, and the detail in some of these maps is really quite extraordinary. And it really can give you a lot to work from if you are, say, looking at if you're a genealogist and you're interested in how place names have changed over time, or especially in the case of cities, looking at how the landscape has changed over time. So where were different institutions, or how did the city get built out? it really can open up a lot of interesting questions and answer a lot of interesting questions. So I think that was about all that I wanted to cover. But again, it's definitely have fun with it, I guess. It's, again, even for the map experts, those indexes can be a little daunting. So give it your best shot. But again, feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you have about the indexes or just about the collections in general. And we have our switched back over to our main page here, and we have an email address that you can contact us at, and that reaches both Heiko and I at the same time. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to Heiko.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Yeah, so we have worked on this a while, and we probably would have waited maybe longer, but then the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and we decided to do like a provisional launch. So, we're still going to add a lot of stuff in the next year or so. As Susan said, probably in the end, about 20,000 sheets. And those sheets are kind of covering the range from the 1870s to 1945, with most of the sheets coming from the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s. And the majority is from German military sources. And as we looked at the maps, we found a lot of maps used Austrian source map data. That means they were based on Austrian maps originally published, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Republic of Austria. So the German military utilized these maps. There was a reason for that. The quality was very high. So I'm going to try, I've never tried this, so you have to be kind of patient with me here. Oops, that's not going to work. Ah, yeah, here we go. Okay, so here we are. So I decided to put the Sachertort in there to emphasize the soft power of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, music, Mozart, many other things. And I also remember it very fondly from the Athenaeum and from the meetings there. It was always my favorite dessert. And so I'm going to try to make it the connection of talking a bit about the Habsburg family, their dynastic empire, and also the story of Habsburg's maps. So I'm going to do that gradually, introduce those different themes. But first I want to brag, of course, here in the Bay Area on the West Coast, we live in a land of plenty. We can get all kinds of food, including Austrian food. And so in fact, right around the corner, there's this fantastic place that serves Austrian food. So here it is. And so it's the world's biggest hot dog chain, and it's called Wiener Schnitzel, but it doesn't serve Wiener Schnitzels, as you might imagine. So if we talk about the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Habsburgs, we have to take a very long view. The Habsburgs have been around as a dynasty, they have been around for almost 1,000 years. And gradually, their history evolved from different places. It starts in Switzerland, and then they moved to Austria and became associated with Austria. And they also were very good at representing themselves and their awesome power. And one way to do that was with a peacock with spread wings. And it would showcase all the territories that were part of the Habsburg dynastic empire. So the peacock is a traditional way of intimidating people and impressing them, not to meddled with the Habsburg family. And of course, another symbol always would be the monarch, the emperor himself. And the person that we think of course, is Emperor Franz Joseph. He had been the public face of that empire from the revolution of 1848 right to World War I. And so he became this figure that became uniquely associated with the empire. And we can see, of course, if we look at Vienna, we can see this great city. You know, there are all these monuments. We can see many traces of the empire. And Vienna is, of course, a city that's both a great place to live. It's consistently ranked #1 in quality of living surveys of world cities. It has been linked, has been rated #1 for quite a long time. But it's also has this kind of, it's also kind of this place that seems a bit, big. I mean, bigger. All the institutions seem a bit bigger than they should be for the city of Vienna, because the city physically is not that large. It's a, it has like less than 2 million people, but it has all these great institutions and museums and collections. And of course, it's because it once was the heart of a big empire. So if we look at the maps, this is a good example. It's a census map that the Germans produced in the 1940s. It used the Romanian census data and mapped it, but the base map is Austrian. It was part of a series called Generalkarte von Mitteleuropa at a scale of 1 to 200,000 and mapped all of Eastern Europe. It was like a famous series. It had like it was mapped at a very high quality, and it shows, change. It shows a world that, of course, doesn't exist anymore. And it's a unique place that's shown on this map. It's the city of Chernihiv in Ukraine. It's a university town. It was, for a while, the provincial seat of the province of Bukovina in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And later on, it was a city called Cernăuți in Romania, and eventually became Chernihiv in Ukraine. So we see all these changes over time. And we also see a census map here. We see different groups. The Romanians are in purple, the Ukrainians are in green, the Germans are in red, and then the other group that's pretty big are Jews. They're in black, they're shown in black. And we can kind of imagine how this map was used to round up people during the Holocaust. So it's the story, so the story is, of course, also a story of German war crimes, of, initially these maps were produced by the military for military contingency planning, but then that kind of changed. It became planning for war of aggression. And in the course of that war, the German military committed crimes. And the Nazi regime, of course, planned those crimes. So this kind of is an example of a document that shows the importance of the Vienna mapping operation, which the Nazis took over. This is like a Kartenbrief. It's a document that was used by the commanding general of the military cartography forces of the German army to inform his subordinates. And if you look at the very beginning, on top at the right, it says, for anything that has to do with the Balkan, send materials to the Heeresvermessungsamt Wien, So the Army Serving Office Vienna was responsible for anything that had to do with the Balkans. So this is going to be my presentation. Susan already talked about the project. I'm going to briefly situate Austro-Hungary, talk about the Habsburg Empire and its cartographic heritage, and then talk about what came after the Habsburgs and how the Nazis used the Habsburg maps. Okay.
Where'd you go? Remember?
Hello? So yeah, traditionally we think of Europe in certain frames. There's Western Europe versus Eastern Europe, break, and it comes from the Cold War. But of course, there are many other ways to view Europe. We're just kind of used to that as Americans. And Europeans, of course, would have other frames, how they would divide Europe. And in Germany in particular, this would be an important one historically. There's this idea that something like Central Europe, Middle Europa, that exists kind of geographically. And Germany is in a way geographically located at the center of Europe. And so I took the image on the west, image on the left, I took it from Wikipedia, and I took the image on the right, also from the Wikipedia page. It uses German data, but it's created by an American institution. But what we can see is that Central Europe is kind of a category that is viable. And if we look at the borders of it, the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire kind of shape what Central Europe is. It's a very core of our idea of what Central Europe is. So let's zoom in a bit and look. So if we look at Europe physically, there's the North European plain, there's the Alps, there's the Carpathian Mountains, and that in-between space between the Alps and the Carpathian Mountains, that's where the Austro-Hungarian Empire took shape. And we zoom in, and we can see, there's something called the Pannonian Plain, and that's, of course, Hungary. And then we can see Bohemia bounded by different mountain ranges, the Bohemian Forest, the Ore Mountains, the Sudeten Mountains. So that's kind of the place. And it looks kind of like a viable place for an empire to emerge. And of course, there's another way to kind of look at this, and that's the Danube. It connects a lot of the centers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it's like a kind of a place that facilitated communication. So historically, if we look at Germany very broadly, the history of it, starts out of the disintegration of the Frankish Empire. Different entities are created, and the easternmost Frankish territory morphs gradually into the Kingdom of Germany. And the building blocks of that empire are the so-called stem duchies. And they're basically the old tribal units, like the Saxons, the Thuringians, the Bavarians. And so they're cultural, linguistic units that still had viability, and gradually duchies emerge. Then this Kingdom of Germany, or German Kingdom, it reorganized itself. So there always had been this idea that Charlemagne had received from the Pope the honorific title of Protector of Christendom. He had become the Holy Roman Emperor. And so this title was always there, but in the 10th century, a German king, Otto II, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And so that kind of changed the nature of this entity that existed in Central Europe. There was still that German kingdom, but there were other territories that gradually became incorporated into this Holy Roman Empire. And the most important one was Bohemia. It was a majority non-German territory. It was majority Czech. Then there were other territories in Italy and also the Kingdom of Burgund. And the greatest size that this empire achieved was just before the Habsburgs rose to power. And it was a dynasty called the Hohenstaufen in southwestern Germany that kind of started to gather strength, and other members of the nobility were afraid of its rising power, especially the last emperor of the dynasty, Frederick II. He seemed like a person that would maybe make a power grab and would be maybe able to transform the Holy Roman Empire. And that, however, did not happen. Frederick II, he was not really an institution builder, even though he was an amazing person. He spoke many languages like Arabic. He was a scientist, an author. So he was a fantastic figure, but not the person to achieve that. So after that happened, there was something happened, the Great Interregnum. For 26 years, there was a lot of confusion. Different kings, sometimes 2 or 3, claimed the title of King of Germany. And it was a very confusing time. Of course, the system politically of electing a king was governed by 7 electors that came together, and they, would vote on who would become king. Their title was Kurfürst in German, from Küren, to choose. And so that was not always as clearly defined who those people were, but later in the 14th century, a golden bull defined exactly who these 7 powerful men would be that would choose the king. And so if we look at the end of that interregnum in the 13th century, these electors, they were looking not for strong leadership, but they were looking for lesser leaders. I mean, people not with a high noble rank, they had kind of gotten into the habit of looking for counts that might become kings of Germany, because they didn't want them to amass too much power. And so one candidate was a man named Rudolf from central Switzerland, Rudolf I of the House of Habsburg. He would later be known as German king. And so the origins of the House of Habsburg lie in central Switzerland and also in Alsace. And we can see the territories that they controlled in purple. And what is clear is that they didn't control any of the major towns. Their strength was mostly in rural areas or in small towns. The big cities of Switzerland, like Lucerne, Zurich, were all outside Habsburg territory. So Rudolf, he was able to become king. He was the first Habsburg to become king. And he was able to use the disorder of the interregnum, this 26-year-long period where it was not always clear who had the power to make decisions. He was able to use that disorder because he would be the person who made decisions about who really should have gotten titles and land and power. And he was able to finagle that into controlling territory around Vienna and in neighboring provinces. And that was a kind of block of territory which provided the actual power of the Habsburg family. If we look, we can see the Habsburgs lost a lot of the territory that was in the West. And we can see it, that it's not filled in solid color. So, for example, the land in Switzerland is this reddish area that's not totally filled in color. It was lost. The Habsburgs lost all the land that had initially provided power to the family. They lost a lot of the land in Italy. However, they held on to the core territory in Austria, and they expanded into various different directions. And the way this happened was through marriage rather than war. The Habsburgs had a policy of thinking hard about marriage arrangements. And one emperor in particular, Maximilian I, he was the person who was able to finagle the tremendous growth of Habsburg holdings. He first of all married Mary of Burgundy. So there was a kind of relationship established, which meant the Habsburgs would ultimately inherit the kingdom of Burgundy. And similar things happened in other parts of Central Europe. The Habsburgs gained possession of Bohemia, Hungary, Spain. So they became like the dominant noble family in Europe in the 16th century because they held like key territories. And of course, we usually in the United States, we usually think of the Spanish Habsburgs and their history. But so the family in the 16th century had to kind of split up the positions between the Austrian part and the Spanish part of the family to settle family business on one hand, but also demands by the estates of the Holy Roman Empire. So there are depictions of the Habsburg Empire, and this is kind of a powerful one. It's by a cosmographer in the mid-16th century, and it shows Europe as the Virgin, it's a powerful religious motive, but it also shows clear Habsburg, symbols everywhere. Like, they had that Spain, a Habsburg territory with a crown. The heart of Europe, that's Bohemia, another Habsburg territory. The symbols of rulership are Habsburg symbols. And there's attention paid to places that are important in Habsburg history, while other places are ignored. And so this is very much the Austrian Habsburg perspective. Vienna and Buda, as in Budapest, are important places, and so is Prague. So if we look a bit later, we can see that the Habsburg Empire becomes under threat in the West from France, which is the dominant power in Europe, and in the East from the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire twice threatened to annihilate the Habsburg Empire. Like, it laid siege to Vienna twice, but failed. And in the aftermath of the second siege in 1683, the Habsburgs counterattacked and they were able to occupy large parts of southeastern Europe. Their troops went deep into the Balkans, led by this famous general, Prince Eugene of Savoy. So if we look at a map in about 1700, a map of Europe, it would have been kind of like this. This was kind of the end of the Spanish Habsburg family. You know, they would soon be governed by a different dynasty. You know, a Bourbon dynasty, so the same as the French. So some territories, as a result of that, changed possessions. The Austrian Habsburgs gained control of those, like in northern Italy and the Spanish Netherlands. But the clear center of Habsburg power is now a solid block of land in Central Europe. You know, it's like it has kind of all come together. Now, France is the dominant power in Europe, and it had kind of had centralizing tendencies for a while. And it was also important in the history of military cartography. In France, for the first time, kind of an institution emerged that produced military maps, you know, for the entire country. It was called the Dépôt de la Guerre. It had existed for quite a while, but in the 18th century, the French Academy of Science, it sponsored a series of maps that covered all of France. In order to do that, one needed to do triangulation. And triangulation is kind of the measurement, exact measurement of certain points to make sure everything matches up. So there is, of course, the general mapping, but there's also the system of coordinating as the mapping progresses. Those other points have already had to be measured, and the measurements are taken outward from those points. They're kind of like the basic network, you know. And so in Indiana, we have that too, of course. Like if we think about the public land survey, we talk about Buckingham's line, you know, and the second meridian. Those are, you know, the basic triangulation of the public land survey system in Indiana. So the French were the first ones to use that. And then a family called the Yazini family, over 4 generations, it created these maps. So it took forever. So if we look at the Austrian history, we can see that the first family, the first Habsburg ruler to get interested in maps was a woman, Empress Maria Theresia. She was influenced by Enlightenment ideas, and in the 1760s, she ordered the first Landesaufnahme, the public surveying of the lands in the entire Habsburg Empire. And one reason she did that was that the Austrians hadn't done so well in a war against the Prussians just before. There was a real need to do this land survey. So it ultimately became named after Maria Theresia's son, Joseph. It was known in German as Josephinische Landesaufnahme, and it took 24 years to survey the entire empire. So it was done by different crown lands, and you can see here how it progressed over time. This is a sheet that shows Vienna and its surroundings. It's still a fairly small city, but we can clearly see the wall. We can see the Danube in the forested area. We can see some roads, important public buildings, parks, and also you know, hilly and mountainous terrain. So if we look a bit later, there's a big transition that has taken place. And of course, it's the French Revolution. I'm not going to talk about it. I don't have really time to do that, but it was a major reset. It reordered the world in Europe in the sense that it brought out new ideas about, for example, the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man. And so those ideas spread, and they called into question a lot of the old ways of doing things. And then, of course, in the course of these changes, Napoleon rose to power, and he, was able to occupy large parts of Europe, including large parts of Germany, and he forced reorganization, first of what the Holy, the situation, the Holy Roman Empire. Then the Holy Roman Empire collapsed, and as Napoleon was defeated, there was kind of a need to reorganize this territory, and it was reorganized as something called the German Confederation. And the key player in that negotiation process was an Austrian diplomat, Metternich, and he, kind of taped everything back together. People talk about the Congress of Vienna, the place, that created this new system and was durable for a while. It lasted and brought peace. So that was a big achievement. It created stability. But at the same time, Metternich also was, the symbol of repression. Austria, the Habsburg Empire, it emerged as a conservative force. It aligned itself with the other conservative powers, Prussia and the Tsarist Empire. And those three kind of worked together to prevent change. So in 1848, there was a revolution in Europe, but it failed. But it meant that Metternich had to leave the political stage. He had a very long run, but in 1848, his time was up. Now, if we look at the Habsburg Empire, an empire cannot be sustained without working institutions, without institutions that are capable. And here we see, in Vienna, we see the Exerzierplatz, the parade grounds, and we can see all those big government buildings that are lining the parade grounds. And the building in the middle of this picture has a globe on its roof. And there's a reason for that. That's the building where the Kaiserliches und Königliches Militärgeographisches Institut was housed. This was the institution, basically the Imperial and Royal Military Geographical Institute of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was housed in this building. And this was the institution that carried out the mapping effort of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And of course, in order to secure one's boundaries, one has to have good maps. And this was also a military kind of endeavor, because it was necessary to have those maps to defend that territory and maybe also to wage war in neighboring areas. So the KUK, Militärgeographisches Institut, it also mapped neighboring territories. And it emerged out of an institution created by Napoleon in Italy. As the Austrians took over northern Italy, they realized this institution had some value, and they temporarily let it exist. And in 1818, they formalized that situation, and it became this Militärgeographisches Institut. So here we are. This is a close-up. So the Kaiserliches und Königliches Militärgeographisches Institut, it's this big machine, the machine that cranked out thousands and thousands of maps. And it was well respected. And the reason was that it made some wise decisions. You know, so it in the 1830s already, it started to think about surveying the empire again in a big survey that was named after the emperor Franz Joseph. It was called the Franziskan Landesaufnahme. And then later they did a third one, but Emperor Franz Joseph was still in power. So it was called the Franzis-Josephinian Landesaufnahme. And the third one especially is the one that cranked out quality maps. And they were based on really good, solid choices. The first one was that the Austrian cartographers, for their triangulation and how they would project their maps, they relied on data that was collected by an astronomer in Königsberg, Bessel. He had calculated distances, and that matched particularly well with the actual, you know, situation in Europe. So his mathematical information that underlay mapping was so accurate that it was still used in the mid 20th century. It was less good for other parts of the world. Other ellipsoids were used there, but for Europe, the Bessel ellipsoid was kind of very good match. This is the building, a different view today. This is one of the maps, one of the topographic maps, and you can see there's also some beauty to these maps. There are other reasons though. The Institute also had started to use the metric system beginning in the late 1830s. And this was long before the Austro-Hungarian Empire adopted it in 1871. So that was a forward-looking decision. However, the Austrians missed the Greenwich meridian. They still were traditionalists when it came to the meridian. They followed the old tradition that goes back to Ptolemy, who identified the Faroe Island as edge of the old world. That was the boundary of his system, the end of the known world, according to Ptolemy. And the Austrians, they stuck with Faroe. And maybe, also because of the connection to Spain, there was maybe a tie-in there. But they didn't switch to the Greenwich meridian until pretty late in the game. So if we look at the mapping that the Austrians did, we can see it's a large area, and it covers much of Eastern and Southeastern Europe. This is kind of the area that's covered. It includes both Berlin and Moscow, Istanbul, much of Greece, northern Italy. Here's another map index. This one is a bit hard to read. And the Austrians also did a good job at standardizing the map sets, and the legends are quite extraordinary. This is an example from the Generalkarte von Mitteleuropa. Oops, sorry. So everything changed in 1866-67. There was a war in the German Confederation, and it was between Prussia and the Austrian Empire about who would control Germany. Until then, a situation had prevailed which was called dualism. There were two big powers in the German Confederation, and the Austrian Empire lost badly. And as a result of that, it had to reorganize itself. It reinvented itself as a dual monarchy, Austria-Hungary. Its focus was now elsewhere. It wasn't Germany anymore. It had been pushed out of German affairs. And if we look at this empire, we can see it was a multi-ethnic empire, quite remarkably so, you know. So even now with a dual structure, if we look, the German settlement areas are the yellow ones, the Hungarian ones are the orange ones, but there are all kinds of other groups. The light green, those are Romanians. The kind of darker red, that's Serbs. Then there are also Croats in that area, Slovenians. If we look farther up, the Czechs and Bohemia. Then there's the Slovaks, and then the darker red, that's Poles, and the lighter red, that's Ukrainians. So this is like a very diverse empire. And it seemed to many that it was an anachronism. You know, some people said it was a prison of peoples. And of course, the 19th century was a century of nationalism, and it meant that the existence of dynastic empires seemed really, they seemed really antiquated, out of date. And here we can see a humorous depiction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You can see all these different groups, you know, kind of vying for power, coexisting in some way. So there is, you know, there is in the center, sitting on the globe, there's a musician playing, that's probably Budapest, I would think, playing an instrument. And we can also see in Vienna, we can see Karl Lueger, the anti-Semitic Bürgermeister of Vienna. So we see different figures, and then we see those stereotypes of ethnic groups. And of course, that kind of brings to mind that, you know, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was, of course, built on privilege. There were two in-groups, the Hungarians, who ran the Hungarian half of the empire, which included many other territories. And there were Austrians, which ran the Austrian part, but there were also many other groups. And maybe most importantly, in the economically very important Bohemia, there was the Czechs, but the Czechs were not given an adequate share of their power. And we can see that all over the empire, there were certain groups that controlled territories, like the Polish nobility controlled the province of Galicia by arrangement with the Habsburgs, and the Ukrainian peasants in Western Galicia, they were totally disenfranchised. So this empire had problems, and it kind of was unable to reform itself. Now, there were certain things that were important about the empire that provided the glue. There was the religion, the Habsburg Empire, you know, the Habsburg family. It supported the religious faith of the population. You know, of course, at one time during the 16th century, the Habsburgs had been Catholic partisans, and they always stood for the Catholic Church. They privileged the Catholic Church, and not only Roman Catholics, but also Eastern Rite, or Byzantine Rite Catholics, so-called Uniates. Here on the map, we can see the Roman Catholics in red and the Uniates in kind of bluish, in a purple color. But they also supported other religions, like, for example, Muslims in Bosnia, Lutherans, and even like a bit Jews. So it was sort of like a diverse, very diverse empire, but religion was like a tie-in for the monarchy. It tried to use it to maintain power. So all that came tumbling down in 1914. Archduke Ferdinand, the heir to the throne, was killed, assassinated in Sarajevo. Of course, this was not like the assassination of a US president. This was much bigger. It struck at the very heart of the empire. A president can be replaced by a vice president, but the heir to the throne, it's not so easy in a hereditary monarchy. So at the end of this war, World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided up. The maps were so important that they were specifically mentioned in the peace treaty that Austria had to sign in a suburb of Paris that ended the war. The plates, the printing plates had to be turned over. Like all the printing plates for the Czechoslovak territory had to be turned over by the Austrians to the authorities in Prague. And the same had to be done for Romanian maps, for Hungarian maps, for maps of territories that covered parts of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. So the maps continued to be of importance because they were highly regarded and important. And of course, if you look at a lot of the states that were formed, the problems about boundaries and ethnic groups, they continue to exist because those countries were still dealing with issues of ethnic minorities. So here's a map of Czechoslovakia, and we can see there's a Czech and Slovak majority that's settled most of the territory. But in the margins, we see Germans, Hungarians, Poles, Ukrainians that lived in some areas around the margin. Here we can see how Hungary was downsized, like to its present boundaries, and how Hungarians, had controlled like large areas where they were a minority. We can see that particular if you look at the territory at the bottom. There are hardly any Hungarians in Croatia. So now we come to the Germans. As the Nazis come to power in the 1930s, they advocate certain ideas, and so their geography played a big role in this. On one side, there's a political geography, geopolitics that German geographers articulate, but there's also a big investment in what might be called human geography, like for example, settlement geography. And so the Nazis were interested in areas where Germans had settled, and they mapped this prodigiously. And so they created certain concepts, like it's a dark black area. That's an area that was settled by Germans, where's a large majority. And we can see there are some outlying areas where Germans settled too, and that's usually depicted accurately, maybe exaggerated a bit, but generally it looks accurately depicted. But then there's another category where the Nazis claim that the people that live in those areas, they have been Germanized. This is really part of the German cultural area. And so we can see like all of Bohemia and Moravia, in Czechoslovakia is supposedly an area like that. We can see large parts of, Hungary, certain parts of Yugoslavia fall into the same category. Of course, this is really problematic and didn't really reflect the true situation of what the local inhabitants thought who they were. So there's this one document that kind of, for the first time, shows how Hitler starts to think about expanding his power outside Germany. Historians kind of debate this document. It's quite clear if you look at Hitler that he changed his mind quite a lot. But still, this is an important document. It was in November 1937. The document is called the Habsburg Memorandum, and it was drawn up by Hitler's military aide, Colonel Friedrich Habsburg. He was the note taker. And so in this meeting, Hitler talks first about himself, that time is of the essence here. He's not going to be around forever, and his leadership is much needed. And then he talks about his idea that Germany economically will always be struggling, and that things don't look so good economically. Something has to change, and so he plans to embark on a war of aggression sooner rather than later by seizing some of the neighboring countries, namely Austria and Czechoslovakia. And he also broadly outlines his later plans for war of aggression. And he thinks that this will happen within the next 5 or 6 years. However, this happened much quicker because of opportunities that opened up to Hitler. And he was able to annex first Austria and then Bohemia and Moravia the Sudeten area that's on the fringes of Bohemia, Moravia in 1938, and then the rest of Bohemia and Moravia in 1939. So he substantially expanded Germany and the territories that it controlled already before World War II. And so what we kind of encountered is, of course, that as this process unfolds, the Nazis, they're taking over institutions in places like Austria and Czechoslovakia. And here we see like Austrian nationalists. Those would have been the people that opposed Hitler, but probably were won over pretty quickly. And here we can also see one of the concentration camps, where a lot of people perished. And so if we look at those institutions, if we look at just the mapping institutions, we can see that German mapping institutions moved very quickly to establish offices in Austria and absorb the existing Austrian mapping agencies. One player was the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme. It was like the civilian mapping agency in Germany, and it established an office in Vienna in 1938. There was a restructuring in the mapping organizations, and they established regional survey offices. In Vienna probably was the most important one because it had huge capabilities. And so this is this office, you know, Hauptvermessungsabteilung 14, Regional Survey Office 14 in Vienna. And it was established solely out of existing staffing resources that the Austrians had, left behind in a way. Institutions, of the Austrian government. And so if we look at the military side, we can see the same thing. There was something called the Army Surveying Office Vienna, the Heeresvermessungsstelle Wien, and of the Austrian Army. And basically, the command of it, a distinguished veteran of World War I, career military officer, he was demoted and had to retire from active duty because he was an opponent of the Nazis, also because he was of Slovenian descent. He was not somebody the Nazis would have trusted. He also had been a book author who argued for the defense of Austria. This is, however, the second in command. We can look at his personnel file and we find that he, was accepted for service in the German army, but it was an appointment. He was ernannt. It was not a career position. So he served kind of in a situation where he wasn't secure for about a year, but then World War II broke out, and then he was taken and accepted into the German army, and he made a career. And we can see that his career in the serving organization was that he controlled serving resources in Southeastern Europe, exactly the area where the Nazis used Austrian resources. So Vienna was this important hub. The Nazis were really lucky to catch all these resources. So there was this local office of the German Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, the regional survey office I talked about. The Nazis now controlled that. There was this army surveying office in Vienna. There was also like a big warehousing complex in Vienna for maps and materials. And then there was the traditional infrastructure at universities, and publishers, and there were related professional societies that studied, Southeastern Europe and different parts of Europe. And traditionally that was directed at parts of Eastern Europe and maybe the Middle East. The Austrians had a long history there. There was also rich, publishing infrastructure in Vienna. So the Nazis benefited from all of this. And we can also see that certain key individuals are important. The Nazis used like an organization, the Reichsarbeitsgemeinschaft für Raumforschung. It's a regional planning organization, and their local point man was a professor at the University of Vienna, Hugo Hasinger. He was a local power broker, and we can see him mentioned in Nazi documents as Leiter der Hochschularbeitsgemeinschaft, as NS Vertrauensmann. Those are like key roles that meant that the Nazis relied on him to facilitate contacts. And we know that he walked into the Nazi offices with lists of people that would be of assistance. He had all the contacts in professional societies and facilitated specialized mapping like ethnographic mapping and mappings that led to economic planning and mineral resources extraction. So if we look at the maps, we can see certain sets are very important. I'm just going to focus on one because we're running out of time. The special map of Austria-Hungary and Czechoslovakia at the scale of 1 to 75,000. Here's a bit of description. That's what you would find in the record if you use the database that Susan showcased. So there's always this description. It can be really useful. It will give a history. It will tell you that how we acquired it through the US Army Map Service. And what's also interesting, I want to direct you to the lower right corner, the lower left corner of the maps. That's where the base data is, the source map data. And this series is particularly interesting because, you know, the Germans use like the old Austrian source map data. They update it. First of all, they issue a new version. This is what this is, the new version of the Spezialkarte published by the German military. And it becomes clear here, you can see it. So this is a version that's resized at 1 to 50,000, the German military. And in some cases, Austrian authorities before the Germans had started to change to have more detailed coverage at a scale of 1 to 50,000. And the German military piggybacked on that effort and published sets for Hungary, for Austria, for the northern part of Yugoslavia. And for some other areas, the Vienna office also played a leading role. We know from a study by Smith's cartographers that the Vienna office also mapped Switzerland. So if we look at the history, we can see this is an interesting map. You know, this is a map that shows triangulation efforts. There are all these special points that are very exactly surveyed. They are surveyed for triangulation purposes in a difficult area, the Alps, you know, so this is kind of unusual, an unusual density of points. So it kind of showcases the capabilities that the Austrian mapping organizations had, and in general, more generally, the German one in World War II, it made important innovations, like it's in the use of aerial photography, military geology, and what I also discussed, triangulation and the use of geodetic grids. So geodesy is the exact measurement of the Earth. I should maybe have explained that. And there are also some innovations here that helped Americans after World War II to roll out new geographic systems like the UTM grid. So here's the end. There's another peacock. I'm sorry I went over time.
Heiko, that was wonderful.
Thank you very much. That was dazzling.
Bill, if you're talking where you're very soft.
What's this?
That's better.
Besser? Okay, good. I want to thank, this was just dazzling. So this is like, I know Nick, Heiko, how much you love mapping. So it's like being locked in a candy store, isn't it? For you, because these maps are so rich. And of course, you have a good understanding of them. And then also I see the similarities with the USGS mapping system, also with the UTM. So what came first, the USGS map system, or what you saw that developed in Austria and Vienna for the empire?
Well, Susan might want to chime in. So two of us, we kind of are working on an article. It's not yet accepted as a review process. And one thing about the German cartographic history is, of course, that German history is so fragmented. There's not a long continuity. If we look at the last 200 years, so with the French Revolution, I didn't talk about it. There also was, of course, a scientific revolution, and we see how organizations scale up. There's small cartographic workshops. Then there is an organization like the French Academy of Science that's sponsoring projects and funding them. And then there are very large organizations like the one I talked about, the Militärgeographisches Institut. But in Germany, the history of that is broken. The different phases. There's no institutional continuity. And in Austria, that's true a bit too. So in the US, what we have is we have continuity. The USGS was established out of 3 bodies in the 1870s sometime. Before there were different organizations involved in mapping, and it has existed ever since. There's this continuity institutionally, so it has, if we don't have that in Germany. I mean, if we look at Germany, first of all, there's federalism. So the states were very jealous, more jealous than the American states. They didn't pool resources. The Bavarians continued with their own mapping institutions. The Hessians continued, the Saxons continued, So we have different players. Prussia was just the biggest player. But if we look at that, we find there was like the Preußische Landesaufnahme. That's the main mapping agency. So it kind of coexists with the USGS. But then World War I comes around, German history changes. It becomes the civilian mapping agency called the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme. But it's not a national mapping agency either, because the Bavarians still won't play ball. They say, we're going to do our own thing. So, the German history is much more complicated than the American one. And that's kind of what we found. So Austria, there's a bit more continuity, and so that's kind of interesting. There's a strong tradition here. We can kind of identify it, but the American organization is more straightforward. It changes, of course, over time, but it has a long run. It's still here today, while in Germany and Austria, structures, organizations changed, and those organizations were wiped out. They had to rebuild from scratch after 1945.
All right, thank you. So, Janet, are there other questions?
One question was about the about your PowerPoint, your slide presentation, and this has been recorded. I did put this in the chat, and the timeline on that. We are still new at putting our Stammtisch online, so at some point that is going to be posted on Facebook. Probably a little bit of delay on that, and then sent out to the people who have been a participant here. So I believe that is how that's going to happen. So, but we do intend to do that. I put in there, thank you for your patience as we develop our virtual Stammtisch strategy. This is our 2nd month of having our own camp. So I did not see another question per se. A lot of comments. People really enjoyed it. Heiko, wonderful, amazing maps.
Thanks to Susan too.
And to both of you. Yes, this is a 2-person presentation.
Thanks for her willingness to do this and help me out and cover part of it. And it's true, Bill is right. This was a bit like a candy store thing. So I went a bit overboard. So I apologize for that. It got a bit long.
Okay.
No apology necessary. We enjoyed it.
Yes.
Now, I've got another question, and I don't know if this will be the last one, but all right. So it's been 76 years since the end of the war. These maps were seized. What would you call this? War booty? But does Germany and Austria are no longer a threat to the United States? So do they want their maps back? That's my question.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we encountered that too. So we address it in the article. And so, you know, like under the Hager Convention of, you know, how wars conducted, the Hager Landkriegsordnung. I don't know the English name, but, you know, it's perfectly legitimate for the US government to take those things, you know. I mean, they were used by the German military by and large to wage war. So there's no issue. However, we found some examples of things, you know, that came from cultural institutions. So those would maybe be considered, you know, reparations. But even taking those, that's legitimate. I mean, you know, there's no, you know, no legal reason for the Germans. However, this is kind of interesting because that actually happened. The Germans asked for some of the stuff back. And to the credit of the US government, in the 1960s, they gave it back. There were long negotiations, you know, in 1961, the US military in Europe handed over a large amount of maps. And in 1967, maps were shipped from the United States to Frankfurt to the Bundesamt für Geodäsie. That's was a national mapping agency at that time. They were delivered there. And so, yeah, so the United States did pretty well. I don't think they have to be ashamed of what they did.
All right. Thank you.
Another
Are
quick
there,
question.
okay.
Somebody put in the chat. What did you mean by triangulation for those of us who aren't cartographers?
Susan, you might want to help me out here. I'm going to try. So in Indiana, we have Buckingham's baseline. It kind of runs across southern Indiana like that. And then we have the second meridian. It goes like this. And it anchors the surveying system that we use for the public land survey in southern and northern Indiana, and pretty much covers Indiana. And so, you know, the surveying is a little gritty kind of stuff. Triangulation is the basic structure of ordering space. So that's usually done through something that's very exactly measured. So when Buckingham went across southern Indiana, he had to take special care. This was not a normal surveying operation. It took like a long time to survey that line because they wanted to get it exactly right, you know. And the same is true with the meridian. They were very careful to, when they marked the areas where they surveyed, they did a really good job, you know. And so this could be done the way Americans did it. It could also be done through different points that are exactly measured. And that's what the land survey does too. The US and the USGS, they have something called benchmarks, you know, points that are measured exactly, and they appear on the maps, they're marked on the maps, and they're kind of, you know, places of orientation. That's maybe how, you know, they anchor kind of the survey system. And yeah, that's kind of my explanation. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great explanation. I'll just add that the word triangulation refers to the fact that if you have 3 points, if you have 2 points, you can help find the third point. So you're kind of using these system of triangle of points to help locate both where things are kind of in terms of the horizontal plane, but then also what the vertical elevation is. So triangulation is kind of using the system of three, like a network of points to figure out where points are.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Wonderful, wonderful,
Good to see you,
wonderful.
Angie.
Good to see you too, Aiko.
Nico Selm's telling us he's glad to see that our cartographical heritage is in good hands.
Mhm.
Me too.
Mm.
Thanks, everybody. This was wonderful.
This was
Good to
really
meet
great.
everybody.
And thank you now.
Great.
War schön, dich wiederzusehen, lieber Heiko.
Ja.
Mach's gut da.
Dankeschön, Susan and Heiko, and it's good to see you. Good work.
Danke.
Okay, well, that's going to close our evening tonight. Bill, anything else, Bill? Is that good?
We'll see. I hope to see everyone on the 19th of March for the annual meeting and Don Heinrich's presentation then afterwards. And if you're not a member, please join. And then we'll have next in April on the 10th, we'll have Nicholas Selm presenting on the German influence and the German activities of the Haymarket riot. And then, of course, leading up to May Day, my Tag as the International Labor Day. See you then.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Bitte schön.
Tschüss.